Congratulations on the Shapiro Initiative. May it thrive and prosper. On Tuesdays, I used to rehearse my lectures at Maria's Bar in Bridgeport, where my activist friends would give me feedback. And come Thursday, I lectured to a room at the University of Chicago. Those lectures on landscapes of capitalism over 700 years became the basis for virtually everything I have done since. From histories of land use and occupancy rights, to the work with data, to reflections on the practice of history and work on climate governance. At great universities like this one, education happens outside the walls of lecture halls as much as on the inside. It happens on long walks with friends, at bars, at protests in the quad, at teach-ins, and conversations so free and public as these are capable of encircling and beginning the process of unpacking questions that seem insurmountable when they are first raised. Whether the problem is how to face down a genocide, how to protect a democracy, or how to address a climate emergency when no extant institutions seem to be capable of doing so. When I first began to teach about climate, I wanted to teach a version of a European history course that would stay with students for the rest of their lives. I wanted to speak to the seeming intractability of the climate emergency, to nod to the apparent failures of both state and market, to peer into the anti-democratic elements of institutions governed by experts. I wanted to use Cleo's lamp to shine a light into the darkness, reassuring my students that even while new forms of technology and government could be used for surveillance, they could also be retooled into a shelter for the poor and subjugated. To tell so encompassing a history as this, I began my account of climate change with the floods that braced Northern Europe during the Little Ice Age, when a brief period of cooling temperatures resulted in overwhelmed peat fields, soil subsidence, and sinking land. Although the half degree of temperature change of the era was minimal in comparison with the climate shifts of our time, the communities of West Frisia faced a series of devastating floods. And they built in response dikes like this one, the West Frisia Omrings dike, completed in 1250. The first floods appeared in 1212 and claimed about 60,000 victims. In 1287, the St. Lucia's Day flood swept away 60 parishes in the Danish diocese of Schleswig. Then as now, victims of flood were most liable to be poor. The community after community began to respond by organizing, by building dikes on a hitherto unprecedented scale. Earthen embankments held back the water. Later, canals lined with windmills, the famous polder system, would continuously pump water away from homes and farms. These late medieval floods remind us that humans have adapted to climate challenges through building and organization, but we should be discriminating about which words we use to conceive of the change. If we label these innovations technology, and we think about the genius of the engineer or the inventor or the wisdom of capital investment, perhaps, but the early modern examples with which I begin are an example of another kind of technology. They're not so much the techne of invention as a technique in the sense of an organization of labor and community. By the 17th century, floods and dike building had become integral to the survival of many communities in Northern Europe. In the Netherlands, a new word, landschap, a correlate of Gesellschaft, a land system, like a society system, came to name two concurrent developments. One meaning of landschap was political. Dikes and windmills required the creation of new political institutions, like the Waterringen or the Dijkreeves, offices that gathered to democratically appoint taxes and labor for the maintenance of the dikes to ensure their repair. But the second meaning of landschap had to do with visual representation. The word indicated a new style of depicting the landscape in the visual arts, whether by painting or through cheaply reproduced engraved images like this one by Peter Nolpe, depicting the bursting of St. Anthony's Dike in Amsterdam in 1651. Images of this sort came to fill the tiny houses of homes across the Low Countries. For peasants who contributed taxes or labor to the landschap also consumed representations of Landschaften in abundance. Graphic representations like this one depicted dikes in a state of crisis, or dikes in a process of repair, sometimes dikes in a state of mellow maintenance, windmills crippled by neglect, or windmills restored, sometimes with Christ presiding over all. They represented the literal infrastructure that kept the community safe, showing the limits that defined the community back to itself. My lectures on the development of capitalism, landscape, and the state trace the importation of windmills and improvement projects from the Low Countries to East Anglia in the era of the English Civil War and the wars over common lands that followed. They traced how ideas about improvement fed Adam Smith's fantasies about an 18th century infrastructure state, how Smith's Scottish and Irish admirers set into action a plan to unify local systems of roads and so extend the benefits of the Industrial Revolution to England's former colonies. I showed how the Industrial Revolution depended on the expansion of a centralized bureaucratic infrastructure state, channeling money, attention, and expertise to every part of Britain's 4 kingdoms. And I led my students in marveling at the key role of this new institution, the centralized nation state, in the transformation of everyday landscapes from the post office to the roadbed to sidewalks around the entire nation. 19th century state projects to build railways required an even vaster effort by states, which began to commandeer extensive stretches of land for railway rights of way. For the early Herbert Spencer and his followers, railway lands signaled that the state had begun a new phase of assembling packages of land for the public good. And it suggested other applications for state-owned land, including public parks, public housing, and state-backed rent control. New movements to protect the commons became the basis for the regulation of smoke in 19th century cities like London and Chicago, ultimately offering a pattern for the future clean air and clean water. I encourage my students to look at the visual representations of the landscape that became the legal and political instruments for new uses of land. For instance, this map of railway rights of way in Nebraska. By literally assembling discrete surveys and their aspirational use to one frame of reference, such a map both enabled the confiscation of native lands for settler colonialism, but it later also became the icon of celebrating and sometimes critiquing the power of the private railroad. In the 20th century, new kinds of political movements would problematize the state's seizure of native lands. In my book, The Long Land War, I described the birth of a global technocratic bureaucracy at the United Nations, where agents mobilized maps, soil surveys, and seed catalogs with the ambition of reconfiguring land ownership on the scale of a planet. The UN officers were responding to post-colonial movements from India to Latin America. They intended to undo the harm of land confiscations by turning land back to the hands of peasants and indigenous people. The effort was partially successful across much of the earth. Vinoba's barefoot march across India to create property rights for India's homeless and the UN initiatives that tried to replicate his efforts around the world challenge us to remember that there have been, in generations past, planetary-wide international efforts to enforce the regulation of land and water in the name of survival. The heirs of the UN ultimately enlisted indigenous movements and dissolved expert rule into participatory new forms of map making, producing artifacts like these indigenous maps that demonstrate Beaver and Cree territoriality. The artifacts are what is known as participatory maps. They document the experience and insights of 500 families at a time rather than one surveyor. They defend collective property rights rather than individual single owner proprietorship. Canada's Indigenous people successfully used maps of this kind to defend their territorial rights against logging and mineral rights companies beginning in the 1970s. And here too, graphic representation of the landscape was instrumental in recognizing new forms of community, new rights, and new ways to manage land and water. Stories such as these serve to remind us, as David Runciman has written, that we are as a species good at inventing political systems, We have invented so many of different shapes, of different scales, with different foci of administration over the last 700 years. And it is not unthinkable that in our time, state alliances will force nations to rein in carbon emissions, to protect carbon sinks, to reserve natural lands, to forestall the sixth great extinction. All that is necessary is that we learn from the past. Even Westerners with strong property rights have historically used the state to demand collective principles governing land, water, and air in the past. And we can do it again. The only question is one of representation, of the flow of information, how to organize the information around us in such a way that our society can apprehend the peril that faces us in the climate emergency. That we have failed to imagine an organ capable of organizing information about planetary boundaries for action is a historical fact. The problem today is that there is no independent bureaucracy, no pont de chaussée, no Army Corps of Engineers or Ordnance Survey responsible for mapping damage and maintaining shared resources. Instead, what the 20th century gave us was the development of pure science, ambitious in its ways of knowing, piercing in its insight, completely divorced from local or state powers that had built rails, dikes, or created or abridged ownership rights in times past. In his study of Cold War politics and climate science, Joshua Howe describes the origins of the Keeling curve, that representation of growing atmospheric carbon based on the collection of data first sampled at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii in 1958. As Howe explains, the Keeling curve was the product of an era when scientists were charged with monitoring the atmosphere, but not with advising government. Meanwhile, government was charged with ensuring full employment, with containing the geopolitical disputes of the Cold War and its aftermath. And in this system, there was no venue for debate or binding legislation charged with handling the implications of discovering climate change. The UN's IPCC conferences were an afterthought, poorly designed for forcing diplomats to reckon with scientific expertise. Lobbyists from the fossil fuel industries were welcome. Their voices rang louder in the ears of diplomats than those of scientists. In the international order that arose after the defunding of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in 1974, to no one fell the task of monitoring society and regulating the use of natural resources for our continued survival. There would be no coherent, centralized administration of air, land, and water, no matter how urgently scientists had shown that we needed it. So if we think about the Keeling curve as the signature representation of landscape for the past 70 years, the equivalent, if you will, of Nope's bursting dike for our time, it gives us a portrait of a society that collects data without a venue for acting on it. The Keeling curve is both the product and the portrait of an era that anticipates disaster while locked into political stagnation and mistrust. In other words, the effect that the Keeling curve has on its viewers is the very opposite of that intended by Nope's picture. If Nope's roaring floodwaters function to unify a community in the face of a common tragedy, in the Keeling curve, the community is absent from the frame and deeply divided about whether the crisis actually exists. Rather than an emergency in need of resolution, the curve presents a riddle. The upward curve indirectly implies a state of despair, but the connection between atmospheric carbon and human communities is nowhere represented. There are no figures on the landscape, figures in the foreground, terrorized by the water. There are no villages displaced by rising seawaters on the Keeling curve, no homes ravaged by forest fires, no African communities on the brink of starvation because their rivers have disappeared. The tiny figures beside the furious waves mark emotion in Nope's representation, but emotion is starkly absent from the Keeling curve. If Nope says to his viewers, look at this tragedy that affects our home, we must act now and forevermore to preserve ourselves. The Keeling curve taunts us. Look at the slowly unfolding tragedy that has persisted through your entire lifetime. Perhaps it is beyond your capacity as a species to contain it. No wonder the anxiety is palpable in seminar rooms. Our philosophers name it. Stephen Gardner diagnoses the aspects of a climate tragedy that pits old against young, rich against poor, developed nations against the developing world. Joel Wainwright and Jeff Mann plausibly diagnose a Leviathan scene where a handful of corporate leaders have assembled total control over the mechanisms of rule, divorcing themselves from the rest of the planet. Scottish essayist Alistair McIntosh gestures towards a missing social movement, asking where are the millions on campuses or in the streets who should be calling to a stop to burning fossil fuels? Under the heading of climate anxiety, psychologists describe a lack of adhesion, a pernicious feeling of incapacity, driven by the seeming impossibility of grappling with the scale of this inherited problem. And anxiety is an appropriate reaction to the temporality of the Keeling curve, a progressive object. It's not an account of a single moment in time begging for political change like the bursting dike, but a continual data collection process. Daily, monthly, the Keeling curve is regenerated and anew, each time indicting its viewers about our incapability of halting atmospheric carbon. As often as we look at it, it asks us, what have you done to stop the juggernaut? It never has any new ideas about what to do. It only offers the ceaseless representation of our failure back to us. To reanimate us back from the paralysis of foregone action, we have to talk about society as if actions and institutions matter. Other contemporary scholars have shown the way. From the business school, Carolyn Kowski writes about the collapse of insurance markets created by runaway wildfires and rising sea levels, prescribing a remedy of state action. From engineering, Deb Chatra narrates how corporate campaigns for recycling and sustainability captured the public imagination, even while the public remained in a state of distraction from the much larger infrastructural systems threatened by climate change. Depleted aquifers, glass skyscrapers, melting road systems merit attention for two reasons, she writes. They are both a site of crisis in climate change, as well as a cause of climate change, and a site where careful engineering and regulation are necessary for survival. Infrastructure thus calls us back to a site of action, a site where something can be done. It reminds us that contemplating our individual carbon footprints is not enough, that individual anxiety before the Keeling curve is downright counterproductive. Reckoning with infrastructure systems is a healthier response because collective administration of resources is vital for responding to the climate problem. Kowski and Chatra challenge us to write a history of the infrastructure state on a planetary scale over the past 70 years. They acknowledge the primary shape of a story in this era as one of tragedy, but they also point to specific questions about how engineering, states, and insurance markets are adapting or failing to adapt to new realities. To write a history of this period of global warming would give our era the blueprint for a collective action that we need, potentially galvanizing industries sector by sector, as well as media and politicians to recognize working strategies for mitigation and adaptation, to generalize successes, to collaborate across national boundaries. Tracing the shape of planetary infrastructure is not the tack of most environmental history or climate research today. Over the past 70 years, we've produced detailed understandings of carbon emissions. It's been much harder to narrate how cultures and institutions respond to a changing climate and its consequences. So what I'm proposing is a new agenda for environmental history, an infrastructural history of climate driven by questions about changing expertise, the changing shape of governance, the evolution of markets, the shape of international cooperation. Now, this is a challenging history to research or write by traditional means, especially if we need it in a timely manner, because the subject is planetary in scale, and there are few planetary archives. Some scholars have used the method of counting words in electronic documents over time, which is now called text mining. Text mining at its heart is an exercise in condensing information. Like the LLMs that summarize text and manufacture human-like writing, the art of counting words over time in text mining reduces information from textual form into another kind of format, often a data-driven timeline of word counts or stories. Now, as we shall see, text mining approaches vary in complexity and nuance. And while a planetary survey of the governance of air, land, and water has not yet been attempted, we have both the data and the methods to venture it. Last year, a team of European computer scientists began monitoring climate discourse on Twitter with the intention of offering us a detailed portrait of changing attitudes towards climate governance. Gehring and Grigoletto used grammar level analysis of nouns connected to verbs to detect a pattern of change in statements about states and markets. They showed that the major narratives on Twitter about climate corresponded with shifts in American presidential leadership. The stories we tell each other are the stories the president is telling us. Headlines about how corporations plant trees and the state supports investment dominated under Trump, but under Biden, the headlines became about how corporations hurt people and states regulate emissions. Text mining exercises like this one promise a solution to the need for an evolving self-portrait of attitudes, actions, and institutions in our time. Like Peter Nolpe's print, and unlike the Keeling curve, the text mining exercise is also a portrait of society. It keeps the humans in view, including a cacophony of opinion about state, market, and the mechanisms of change. But with the help of visualizations such as this, we can see the wave coming on the figures in the landscape. Meanwhile, other researchers have trained the tools of text mining on other institutions. Michael Zielinski and his collaborators monitored shareholders' meetings for climate talk from 2010 to 2018. They found an uptick in climate discussions. They analyzed climate talk against other indices of climate emissions and found that the talk was not idle. It actually resulted in corporate reform, reduced emissions from those corporations. Another team of specialists in journalism hand-coded a database of articles about climate change since the year 2000. They found in 2015 a marked decline in accounts of climate doom or local disasters. Instead, since 2015, magazines have favored climate sustainability stories about heroic leaders and inventors. Now, this is interesting, but what's important about these findings for our purposes is the portrait of corporate institutions that they offer us. I've elsewhere written about the power of auditing, audits such as these, as ways of extending democratic values in civil society. Like the Keeling curve, the computationally generated text mining exercise is self-perpetuating. You can, once you've done the code once, you can perform the code next month or next year with no extra effort. The audit can be reproduced on a daily or annual basis to monitor ongoing changing attitudes. As such, audits of corporations, newspapers, congresses, or Twitter can help us to continuously gauge how the institutions around us are evolving, whether they are keeping climate discourse alive or how, whether technologies and which technologies or solutions they focus on, which disasters and populations they have silenced. Now, while they ask skillful questions about public perception and media frames, the questions of the articles published thus far about the expertise of the person asked follow the expertise of the person asking the question. Journalism professors study media frames. Business school professors test the efficacy of shareholder activism. These are splinters of history as a whole. They take one domain as the route in, and these domain-driven exercises may do important work, but they also neglect macro-scale questions about how institutions and society are changing, failing, or reinventing themselves in response to climate. They make little time for understanding how states' ambits of authority are changing in the present era. So if we draw an infrastructure history, we can highlight some of the themes that present studies have neglected. Where it is that cities are rebuilding for climate resilience and where city government is reacting with neglect, how national and international approaches differ, how these actions map onto power, whose agency we can trace through climate rhetoric and climate silence. My research has taken some preliminary steps towards identifying political agency by asking how speakers in Congress silence the advocates of climate science by instrumentalizing a rhetoric of suspicion. In the dangerous art of text mining, I trained text mining on the debates of Congress to reveal patterns in attacks on environmentalists since 1973, when Alaska Senator Ted Stevens first started to minimize environmentalist positions as alarmist during his defense of the Trans-Alaska oil pipeline. Using word embeddings allowed me to track the changing contexts in which the word environmentalist was invoked over 5-year periods. I filtered the data further to highlight a shift in language under the leadership of Newt Gingrich in the era of Fox News, when the emotionally charged language of climate extremists and climate elitists exploded as Republicans in Congress exchanged memos on how to denounce liberals from the same page, decrying scientific consensus on global warming as the work of ideologues. Today, students of mine in the Department of Quantitative Theory and Methods at Emory are asked to train new methods to highlight how we might track the changing discourse of climate governance in new ways. This semester, a political science major examined how members of Congress spoke about various bills, divided by party. A double major in psychology, meanwhile, became curious about the use of pronouns, and she tracked the decreasing use of the first person plural after the year 2000, marking the rise of a language of suspicion and the disappearance of language invested in the collective ownership of our forests and our oceans. So my lab is gathering stories to map, words to catch. We need climate history, and we read climate history across many fields. We write down research questions that can be tracked through text mining, which is to say, not all questions relating to climate can be used through this method. But there are questions that are capable of being asked on a large scale through these methods of counting words, grammar, cultural, political sensibilities that are represented thereby. So whether we're studying insurance lawsuits, city government, or drought in the developing world, the intended process is the same. We look for the names of places or concepts. We count them, we plot them in a visualization so we can see the processes taking shape around us. We aim to capture the ephemeral shapes of carbon emissions as they erode our polity and our economic security, tracking how the slow flow of emissions lays waste to the world around us. Understanding climate discourse in the 21st century requires new methods, and hybrid labs like mine, where data scientists read history and historians read data science, it's not just a one-time act of interdisciplinarity, which is why I use a different word, the hybrid, are the place where these methods are being invented in real time. We believe that our approach can teach us how to condense the beliefs, attitudes, promises, and debates of society, corporations, and governments into windows on the present every bit as compelling as Peter Nolpe's portrait of a flood. "15 years ago, when ideas about text mining for historical analysis were first introduced, many historians were skeptical. They worried about the privileged and European bias of mainstream data collection, about the black box nature of the algorithms that were packaged with Google Books. In the past 10 years, however, historians' approach to text mining has become newly robust, meaning that we can trust the work of text mining to take on a portrait of climate change in our time. Let's review the evidence that these methods are sound. In 2014, when a debate erupted about the History Manifesto, one of the major misgivings of some humanists about data was the fear that naively consuming data would lead to the silencing of subaltern experiences in history and the return of meta-narrative. Instead, the past decade has witnessed the formalization of questions about the bias of data-based archives. Post-colonial scholars like Rupika Rassam sought out the uses of text mining for reading imperial archives against the grain and gave examples of smaller scale data-driven investigations by indigenous and local communities, which they set aside special uses of data like the recovery of micro-histories of the slave trade, where text mining at scale is inappropriate for the work. Text mining, meanwhile, was embraced across the humanities and social sciences. By 2020, history saw the first monographs that used text mining as an approach, followed by monographs that relied upon mapping and network analysis for their methods. As more and more historians inspect computational approaches to text, they had an opportunity to select from methods that favored change over time as the primary means of investigation, which is a different concern than our colleagues in sociology and literary studies bring to the table. And that meant that we started selecting for certain algorithms that dramatize the changing meanings of words over time. For instance, Vivek Kulkarni's algorithm for detecting changing word contexts, which has since been applied to detecting the changing meaning of Mandarin characters from 1850 to 1950. As historians became critical users of computational tools, many find that it's useful to start not with computational theories of prediction, but with fundamental historical building blocks for understanding temporal experience. The categories of event, period, influence, and memory offer opportunities for identifying appropriate forms of computational analysis that can be put into dialogue with our theory of how we understand temporal experience. So let me concretize that for a moment. In a chapter addressing the category of memory, I showed that an algorithm called named entity recognition can detect the names of historical events in speeches given in the House of Lords and House of Commons and Parliament. I used the results to construct a double timeline where the names of historical events are on the y-axis, while on the x-axis, we track the date when those events were mentioned on the floor of Westminster. The resulting visualization reminds us that the fears of a new French Revolution dominated British debates during the whole of the 19th century. It also directs us to some surprising and unknown findings. For instance, how unremarkable the American Constitution seemed in British debate early in the 19th century until the Great Reform Act of 1832 enfranchised the middle class, after which it occurred to the British that perhaps there was something worth talking about in this American Constitution after all. Algorithms can help us to detect the distinctive words that were spoken in the 1880s, but not the 1870s or 1890s. Other algorithms can help us test long-term aspects of change, like modernization theories that stress urbanization, secularization, and expertise as aspects of development. Skillful coding allows us to tackle problems of scale, moving from two-word phrases that contain the word environmentalist to the speakers of those two-word phrases, to the individual speech acts of any one speaker, thus navigating from the historic explosion of slurs against environmentalists in the era of Fox News to the individuals responsible for those attacks. Turns out that only 6 speakers in Congress were responsible for 90% of the attacks on environmentalists, which gives us a very different portrait of what was going on with the Republican Party at that time. If it's only 6 speakers, it's not the whole of the Republican Party. So tracing each phrase back to its original context allowed me to prove that not only had Alaska Senator Ted Stevens invented the idiom of the alarmist environmentalist in the 1970s, it was also the very same Ted Stevens who, after 9/11, coined the idiom of the radical or extremist environmentalist, extending contemporary caricatures of radical Islamist terrorists to his long-term adversaries in the climate movement. Validated against his existing historical knowledge, vetted in the major journals of our field, and validated by quantitative practitioners, text mining methods are ready for use. We can apply them to the study of climate governance over recent timelines in full confidence that text mining can detect major events, shifts in cultural and political rhetoric, as well as helping us to identify periods, agency, and acts of memorialization. The methods of text mining, in short, are up to the task of rigorous historical interpretation. Now, because this is a talk at the University of Chicago, and because my audience includes distinguished professors as well as their students, I want to say a few words about the foundational work of Chicago in particular in the methods I have been discussing, before I touch on how these methods have traveled. The longue-duree approach to history was in place in Chicago already in the 1950s, when William McNeill began his ambitious project of a multi-volume history of the world inspired by his mentor, Arnold Toynbee. McNeill's influence partially explains the shelter that Chicago offered to other longue-duree projects, whenever historians bucked convention to write long-term studies of copyright, of medieval Judaism, of objectivity, of Western and Chinese paths to economic development, of women's experience in America, and of the Mexican ejido, rebelling against an overall North American trend of a focus on microhistory to attempt audacious experiments in narration, the like of which was little known for much of this period outside of Chicago. After 2014, the debates around the History Manifesto emboldened an explosion of longue-duree narratives in North American history more generally. from Jill Lepore's These Truths, where she explicitly identifies her project as exceptional for taking on a long stretch of American history in search of American identity, to experimental investigations on political economy, like Scott Reynolds Nelson's Oceans of Grain, which takes on 10,000 years of the grain trade, to climate-driven inquiries about how different civilizations responded to climate disruptions in the past, in the work of Jeffrey Parker and Kathleen Duvall. But longue-duree history is far from the only domain where Chicago contributed foundational scholarship for the methodological approaches that matter for writing histories of climate. Long before studies in the Anthropocene, Chicago was already promoting a distinctive scholarship on the politics of land. From W.J.T. Mitchell's work on the politics of landscape to Elizabeth Helsinger's investigations into English landscape painting, through Emilio Corey's longue-duree history of the ejido. In more recent decades, the study of environmental history has flourished here, even developing into a specialty in infrastructure. And in each of these arenas, Chicago provided new answers about how to study natural resources. For instance, Depeche's interventions on the challenge of scale in studies of the Anthropocene. Today, studies in infrastructure and the landscape have been emulated well beyond Chicago, especially in the form of the infrastructure turn, which is alive and well in studies of Britain and its empire, and in studies of the developing world, as well as contemporary capitalism. An infrastructural special issue will soon appear in 18th century studies, co-edited by myself and David Alf. It will foreground infrastructure stories about Spanish Empire, about the infrastructure of slavery, about the relationship between infrastructure, economic path dependency, and the Anthropocene. Nor should we neglect Chicago's pivotal role in modeling computational approaches to humanities and social science questions. Long before the present digital turn took hold in European scholarship, where it is now on its leading edge, at Chicago, computational approaches to text were already being looked to as a way to study the longue-duree by Robert Morrissey and his philologic team, who had already engaged in major debates about conceptual history with leading historians like Daniel Rogers by the 1990s. By the 2010s, Chicago sociologists like James Evans and Chicago artists like Jason Salavan were investigating the uses of computational approaches to average cultural trends and trends in scholarship over time. And here too, Chicago anticipated global scholarly movements. Conceptual histories inspired by the Chicago model now fill European journals of intellectual history. Scholars at Cambridge now use computers to validate and extend the conceptual histories of Raymond Williams and Reinhard Koselleck. Why stop at 20 words when the computer can find the 200 words that change their meaning the most over the saddle site? While the mainstream of text mining for historical analysis has yet to penetrate most American universities, every major European and Canadian university now boasts a specialist in text mining who is teaching a generation of graduate students how to ask longue-duree questions through the computational analysis of text. In short, there has been a transformation of contemporary history, which more or less approximates the suggestions that I made with David Armitage in 2014, a longue-duree approach to history, emphasizing histories of climate and landscape on a global scale, using text mining as a tool. I wrote about these ideas in the manifesto because I had imbibed these ideas at Chicago during my 2-year Mellon postdoctoral fellowship. In the decades since the manifesto, Chicago ideas have gone on to transform the historical discipline at large. Today, the Chicago approach to history represents one of the most promising avenues for writing a new kind of history capable of reckoning with the transformations of governance and society in the era of climate change, treated on a planetary scale. Now, having identified a robust set of methods for understanding climate change, we might next ask, what does it look like when a modern program of study is set up at a university? In wrapping up this lecture, I want to bring together some observations about what investing in this program looks like on the scale of institutions and interinstitutional organization. For while certain aspects of the research project I've outlined are within the grasp of individual graduate students with only a semester of methodological study, or maybe just a little bit of extra reading, the full program of research that I am advocating of text mining the governance of climate change describes an ambitious program that requires institutional level investment and development. So let's look at that. What collaborations on text mining climate change discourse require is data, tools for indexing the data, methods, and appropriate tools for sharing reproducible findings with other researchers and the public. The good news about these requirements is that many of them already exist, and they can be sourced from data science departments like my own at Emory. For instance, the data science students in my department are currently working on a project to create a digital archive of textual reports about climate. We are in the process of gathering data from recent congressional debates, Supreme Court opinions, Edgar corporate reports, World Bank reports, world media, and UN reports. And we intend to share this data with collaborators at Stanford, Princeton, the Emory Law School, and Emory Public Health to instigate a program of study premised upon a division of labor. Data science students need opportunities to scrape data from institutional websites. Many of these institutions have made historical archives of reports available. Data science students need the opportunity to assemble that data in usable form to create computational indices of major concepts and keywords that changed over time, because these are skills that they need to put into practice. And all of this can be provided from my current department. In seminar rooms in history departments, law schools, and public health, meanwhile, graduate students can use the outputs of labs like this one to hasten the work of research. In this vision, social science and humanities departments become the site where research questions are formulated, using topic models and word embeddings as finding aids, as indices of the words that are changing, or the place names, or other markers of conceptual and cultural change. These qualitative researchers can use our indices and applications to navigate primary sources, producing narrative accounts of catastrophes, successes, and turning points in climate governance in our era. A more challenging horizon of study is presented as researchers want to go after specific data sets that are difficult to assemble. For example, the archives of the American White House and State Department. To actually tell a planetary scale history, scholars will need to identify and prioritize a variety of leading institutional archives around the world. And the White House archives are an important instance of the challenges of archival digitalization and the problem's relevance to contemporary history. As Matthew Connolly tells us, the last time a presidential archive was preserved as an archive was 2005. The presidential libraries founded since that time function like celebratory museums. They're not entire archives of the White House's work, its internal memos, etc. Connolly argues that the historians of the present have access to about 1/3 of the scale of materials available for of the scale of the materials of the 1970s when they turned to research in the 1990s. And he believes that this is because the archives have essentially given up. They didn't know how to face ingesting emails into an archival system starting in the 1990s. The National Archives gave up. The Library of Congress gave up. It was easier to work on 19th century documents. And so we have essentially a missing chunk of documentation in the archive, and this continues into the present and will continue into the future unless there is a movement for change. Connolly presents a crisis for historians of contemporary American history, at the heart of which are questions about whether history departments are willing to take the steps necessary to ensure that our discipline remains capable of relevant, timely commentary on governance for the past 40 years. Now, solving this question is a mad problem that should concern historians beyond the scope of environmental history, and certainly beyond historians who are interested in methods. But it requires collaboration on a scale wider than individual scholars. Connolly isn't going to solve this on his own. Even his department cannot solve it on its own. If we look to the successes of other nations and disciplines where digital scholarship has been successfully integrated into ambitious programs of study, we will find that they depend upon a variety of overlapping supports that exist beyond the scale of the department or the university. There are scholarly networks in literary studies, like the Victorian Data Collective, where 20 scholars pool resources together to digitalize some set of archives that they want to go after, and then to make the indices available to their graduate students and themselves for future research. In Europe, there are national networks of historians and their deans who convene to lobby national governments for increased funding. Getting 20 deans of history together to write a proposal means that the discipline of history can argue with the national government about whether history should not have 2% instead of 0.5% of the national budget for physics or biology. And that 2% is transformational for the work of archives. In Europe, there are also annual conferences that convene historians experimenting with new methods. In Sweden, there's an annual conference merely for the historians of parliament who use digital methods. And there is one from every university in Sweden, a paper from every university. So my expectation is that we will continue to hear more about these precedents and how North American history needs to form similar networks of scholarship to join the digital turn. In January, the AHA will host a research panel assembled by William Thomas on research with myself, Matthew Connolly, and some representative participants from European research networks to look at the issue head on. And we expect to ask, what would it mean to call Congress, the national academies to task, to do what the Europeans have done, to ask for enough money to run our archives and our history programs correctly? Now, none of this will happen automatically or even easily, but there are opportunities for leadership in leading departments like this one, for them to convene their own discussions with leaders from the National Archives, researchers in Europe who have pioneered big research, and senior historians from many interrelated fields to talk about what research needs to be supported and how. So when I ask in my title, how to study it, whether the subject is the global administration of land, air, and water, or merely American geopolitics in the era after 1970, it is increasingly important that we lay plans to study together. It is not feasible for any one scholar, even for a Matthew Connolly, to instigate the collection, preservation, and digitalization of White House documents when regimes want to cover them up, to obfuscate what they have done. This is an effort that requires the work of the AHA in lobbying Congress and the investment of archives and other institutions. If money and resources are pooled to digitalize archives for the use of American historians, it's important that the archives be diverse and representative across time periods, identities, and geographies. And it's also not appropriate for any one scholar, therefore, to lead conversations about what gets digitalized first and how. It must be a professional conversation. So in the conversations that are to come, the entire body of historians must speak with one voice, making demands on the Library of Congress, National Archives, et cetera, also speaking to the SSRC, to the Mellon, to our other funders about how to make money available for a prioritized list of archives. And the challenges of partnership and collaboration here may be a novelty to many historians of our generation. We arrived with functioning environmental history conferences and labor history conferences. We attend gatherings forged by others, but they're not without precedent. The names of the labs on the screen are the names of some of the institutions on the forefront of text mining research today. Some, like Living with Machines, are short-term projects that convene dozens of researchers to address a thematic subject over a period of 5 years. Others, like the Princeton Center for Digital History, are permanently funded research institutions with dozens of FTEs attached, dozens of full-time staff researchers, representing a provost-level commitment to support students and faculty research at an individual university. 2 of these projects are funded in the tens of millions of dollars, while others make do with a commitment of a handful of faculty accompanied by the energy of graduate students. What the labs on the screen have in common is that they are collective projects. Traditionally trained historians have decided to make time to sit down with computationalists, to ask hard questions, to produce new work. The resulting labs are remarkable assemblages of energy, money, and talent, and they are putting into play the kind of new institutions that can support data-driven studies of the administration of air, land, and water. What they are not is the individual project of a single assistant professor, an adjunct, or a postdoctoral fellow. Facing a climate emergency, we too need ways of identifying, organizing, and narrating catastrophes and transformations of the immediate past decades on a planetary scale. We have been able to track emissions, attempts to contain them, the experience of harvest failures and mass displacements, and attempts at solving them. To do this, we have to be able to pull together an unprecedented amount of data, to analyze it historically, to narrate it in such a way that the experience can be grasped. We need a dual practice of history and data science together. And to support that, a single historian, an adjunct hire, or even an assistant professor is not enough. There must be institutional realignments. There must be institutional investments in the kind of collaboration that can support a planetary history of climate change in the recent past. A new history of the administration of land and water in the longue-duree is badly needed for our civil discourse, in part to break us from the dispiriting specter of the Keeling curve, the icon of a world where we endlessly document the emergency around us without being able to organize a response. The elements necessary for writing this history are known. Some data is available, the tools are near to hand, but pursuing these questions in a deliberate way requires institutional, trans-institutional supports. At this stage of scholarship, joining the digital turn isn't a matter of hiring a staff member to teach methods and a class of text mining to graduate students. Serious groundbreaking scholarship at this stage requires senior faculty to move institutional money, to start trans-institutional partnerships that prioritize and obtain access to appropriate archives. It requires someone in a data science department digitalizing the data and developing appropriate methods. It represents a shift of perspective from individual scholarship to partnership. And while this may feel foreign, it is also a direction where European historians, literary scholars, sociologists, and many other social scientists and humanists have already gone. At this stage, perhaps the most important work for us to do together is to convene to ask, what are the most important archives that, if digitalized, would help us to write a political economy of institutional reactions to climate change over the last 20 years? What practices as advisors would help our graduate students to benefit from these archives? So I propose to invite the environmental historians of Chicago to make a list of the most important archives, to rank those archives according to their priorities. What archives would be necessary for an encompassing planetary history of global warming? And I propose that together with Emory data scientists, law school and public health experts, the digital humanists of Stanford, we go after this project. We can talk about many things in the Q&A, but perhaps one of them could be to nominate archives and fundamental questions that could be approached by text mining these projects. My point in this talk has been that the conditions of scholarship are much like the conditions of the infrastructure systems that scholars of the administration of land, air, and water have studied over hundreds of years. We must grasp them as a community or not at all. That would be excellent. And I will, yes, I will sit.
Let's start off with one. Thank you, Joe. That was very interesting, and I've actually just finished reading your book on data mining.
Oh.
So I'm totally persuaded of the argument and what you're saying. But the question I wonder about distinction is the whole question of how one represents the past. And for the purpose of, let's say, activism, active action, there are two kinds of action one can think about. One can think about action as speaking to policymakers, as well as the encampment that's going on our grounds, which is actually action on the streets. Think of the two representations, the Nolpe painting, which speaks of the dikes being broken by floods, and it speaks immediately to me in the way that recent photographs of Dubai being flooded. Because in traditional history writing, all the metaphors that we make of verbs usually refer to verbs that also describe what humans do. To take the rise and fall, you know, the Roman Empire, whatever. We rise and we fall. Falling is one of the first experiences of a little human being. And of older human beings as human life expanded. Falling has become a frequent experience of aging. So rise and so I mean this is the point that philosophers have made often, that actually history's metaphors speak directly to the phenomenology of human experience. And that's why we don't even, you know, the present grows in revolt. We see flower rising.
Yes.
So rising is something we know.
Yes.
Whereas the killing cloud doesn't speak to me in the same way.
Yes.
It needs mediation.
Yes.
It needs mediation by knowledge, it needs mediation by experts, it needs, you know. So that's why I think the problem, we already know the history of economics and the way that discipline gets corrupted by speaking to policy, by speaking to powerful. You can't rub shoulders with powerful people without, while keeping the basic historical historians' commitment, not to historical truth, because that's debatable, but to being truthful about the past. I mean, you look at, I mean, you just have to go back to the history of the Anthropocene in this country, to the Paley Commission, to the MIT economists forging ideas of growth, to somebody like Robert Solow giving this famous lecture in 1974, building on Nordhaus actually and saying if we can substitute for a resource that's actually getting exhausted by technology and substitution, then the exhaustion of a resource, I'm putting it already, the exhaustion of a resource is an event of a catastrophe. These are all happening on forgetting of the past. Economics is a discipline based on forgetting of the past, which is why Marx, remember when Marx was there, he telling the story of Robinson Crusoe. And actually arguing how the discipline of political economy makes its own myths look eternal.
Yes, yes.
So there's a particular, I mean, I think I have in two minds. I think what you're suggesting is good. It runs the risk of a very certain particular understanding of action and power.
Okay.
Our students in the grounds may be much less knowledgeable than us about the history of the needs. And maybe some of the arguments don't have complexity, but what moves people on the streets? Something that speaks directly to the. So my question is, what's the connection between two kinds of representations in your head and your experience? Or do you think you're speaking only one kind of representation? You're not speaking to all of them?
Yes. So, first of all, I want to just pull apart two of the things that may have been justified. So one is, speaking to power and having the authority to take a critical position. The problem with economics is that it doesn't take a critical position. It speaks to power. And then, but you can also speak to power to demand resources. And so I just wanted to distinguish and pull that away. That much of the talk was about organizing to ask power for certain resources that are a precondition of the kind of work that's critical of power. And that's the case of Nazi power. So in the book that I decided to text mine, it's in the first third setting up theoretical orientation. One of the chapters is called critical search. And critical search is my theoretical position on the work of data. And it's not automatic. In no case do I think that it's pushing a button and getting it from Durée as a final word. I describe it as an iterative process that takes many forms. And at the end, what I imagine is that We may have some data visualizations, but they are not the whole story. The story is the narrative. And the narrative is woven by going back to the text, back to the primary sources, by looking for experiences and then organizing them in that imagination. So you're thinking about a shape of time. The data-driven visualization might tell you, we talk about our forests and rivers less now. And that may be the instigation for asking, what is the rest of the big story? What are the implications of that? But to unfold the implications is more than that first observation. In other words, it's a very, very short paper. And that's one of the reasons why I don't want this work in text mining and data science text mining climate change to stay in data science departments. I spend a lot of time, I didn't do this work here in this talk, but in the book, I spend a lot of time talking about the horrible history that is written from data science and computer science departments, because fundamentally they don't care about a relatable narrative that is recognizable in human experience. They care about proving that the algorithm works well enough. And once they've given you a proof, they don't want to work with it anymore. So in the data science department, when I have authority, I can use them to do the things that they want to practice, which is to provide indices of the words, the framing concepts, etc. But I want the fruit of that to be used in history. So we're used to using findings. We're used to using multiple kinds of sources. These are just some sources. They're definitely not the individual source.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, it's good to have a strong programmatic talk and call for battle. So thank you for that. I'm trying to sort out in my head the historical and also causal relationship between the visual and the data. I think a cynical listener, which I'm not, a cynical listener now would say, okay, you're right, the visual retreats, we have a vacuum and evacuation, and now it's all data. But then why do you want to spend all your time on data? It seems data is perhaps the problem. That's just an observation. But I wonder whether you're a little bit too harsh about the visual emptying of the sort of social political imaginary of the problems we're facing. Because in the shift from landscape to environment, in the sort of middle of the 20th century, you have a new image, and that's planet Earth. So famous, the famous image of the Earth seen from the space station becomes really iconic, and you can see it feature this planet. If you look at not climate crisis but sustainability, companies, universities, and many others represent it as the globe, which often seen as we hold it in our hands, whether that's true or not. It seems to me more that the problem is not a visual emptying, but that what you have at the moment is a diachronic movement, so that you have, in terms of high-level discourse and science, you have planet Earth, that's sort of media friendly. If you go down to social movements, so last year, Earth Day, I went to Westminster. Thousands of people, lots of tents, but what do I see? I see people dressed up as bees or having posters about their frogs. So what you have is a kind of late 19th, early 20th century image of nature, which is really driving the people to activate. You don't have many people worrying, they worry about carbon, but they don't mind that it's not represented, because for them, these, the frogs are a way to fight the climate crisis. So I do think you have, well, I'd be interested to hear what you think, whether, you have little time, so you may have over-dramatized deliberately, but is it really gone, this visual imagery?
Yes, well, I'm not persuaded that bees and the frogs are really left over from the Victorian imagination. I think that was another natural theology type of moment that's been just, how one of those has argued that space has been filled in by expertise. There's concern about extinctions, about breakdown of ecology, but it's coming from a different place. It's not, Although there, we could also look into it and it would become more complicated. There would be rewilding movements, there would be there would be so many subject positions that could be filled. But the extended version of this argument about the Keeling curve is just drawn on a year of New York Times visualizations in which the front page after front page, God bless them, at least they're covering the climate crisis, but it's data-driven visualizations of the uptake in carbon, the uptake in methane, the uptake in natural disasters. And that the data-driven representation does work. It tells us that we are in the middle of a crisis, but there is something, what I'm trying to get at is that there is something hollowing about the data that isn't hollowing about a narrative or about a photograph in which the figures are in the landscape. And what's appealing to me about text mining is that it has this function of an audit of aggregating data, but the humans are still in the landscape. So that's the point that I'm trying to make. There are ways of doing data aggregation on text so that the figures in the landscape disappear, but there are ways of doing it so that our emotions and our pronouns are all present. So that's the promise. It's just a little pulling of the data back into the humanities space. If I pull that a little further, it's that the data-driven visualizations in the New York Times are coming from Cold War science. They're coming from the world that Paul Edwards describes, Deborah Cohen describes, this world of NSF-funded projects of science for science's sake, monitoring atmospheric carbon comes out of Cold War missile dynamics, not a concern with global warming, because we didn't know that there was global warming until afterwards. The science for science's sake is in the habit of producing visualizations to monitor it, and maybe those visualizations are insufficient because of the two cultures problem, because the scientific data imagination has been so divorced from the humanities imagination, and because it's been so hard to bring them back into dialogue merely with the power of narration. Could it be that a humanities visualization can open the dialogue between the two? So that's the ambit.
I'm going to insert my privileges here and just follow up on Frank, because I think there's an intermediate form that's emerging. It's really important and interesting. And that's, I wish I could show you the image, but the planetary boundaries, right?
Yes, yes.
Which combines the whole data, the Keeling curve, in a multidimensional way with a precautionary view of how far economies can grow. It's really fascinating, like a built-in moral story.
Yeah.
Now, I'm the first to admit, planetary boundaries has been appropriated by the left as well as the right. There's a neoliberal reading of that, where growth can go on and corporations are good. There's also Jason Hickel and Karen Rayworth. Maybe not everyone on the left, but certainly a few on the left are paying attention and appropriating that.
Yes.
And so what do you make of that kind of intermediate?
Yes, yeah, I mean, I think it is. I think that's an excellent point. That is a sort of bridge. And yet, I was writing this, I was trying to imagine Natasha's question. And every turn, I imagined Natasha asking questions about the figures in the landscape and where the social experience is. And I found this.
I think what you're saying is, yeah, I think what you're saying is right. I mean, this merit, there's no question, I'm questioning the merit in what you're doing. I'm sorry for coming in. But I think there's a tension between the discipline we speak from and these new areas. In a way, this notebook painting tells me how much it easily translates into what museums can do, what exhibitions can do, what performances can do. Right, in terms of narrating crisis. But clearly, in relation to data, first of all, one has to think about the question that you don't ask in the book, and the book is one thing, but what does data do to us? In other words, see, data comes out of a huge scale of management, right? And it's clear that history has evolved valuing the individual. Even Ramka was valuing the senior and the unique, whereas data is actually valuing patterns. Right? And that relationship between the respect for the unique, which is so inherent in a kind of most of history writing until the dominance of economic history, but even economic history can have that version. And that tension between that perspective individual and a recognition of the world as information.
Yes.
There's a real tension in that. And my question really was, do they lend themselves to the same kind of politics, the same kind of activism? And what is the kind of action on behalf of which you see the discipline working?
But
Joe, can we take a few more questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I
we
didn't-
have dinner. It's,
We have to-
Exactly.
there's a lot to say and
Yeah,
you have
no,
to
no.
engage it, and I have a lot to get, but
Yeah,
please, I really
have-
do want to hear all the questions.
I have Aaron, Adrian, and Nolan. Anybody
I have
else?
several questions at once,
Oh,
and can we stay a little longer? I see that we only have,
we have an hour before dinner, so we
excellent, okay.
Okay, so I have more questions along these lines that I'll save for dinner, but I guess, I mean, as an enticed novice to the methods, I have a question sort of about the relationship between theory and method and the way the theory of the object kind of inflects the design of the data techniques themselves. So I just had a meeting with a graduate student who's doing some reading in environmental history, and we were just talking about how one of the kind of striking peculiarities of a lot of kind of left inflected eco-social theory is its utter agnosticism about the war-making capacities of states. Nancy Fraser's chemical capitalism, for all of its capaciousness, basically describes the state as an infrastructural state, like its job is to kind of create the institutions that allow markets to function and little bits of violence to kind of keep things in order. But you know, the U.S. military is one of the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world. So the question is, you know, the talk is put together so that we have a kind of theory of the state that is a helpful response to, say, something like, you know, to a kind of Jim Scottish conception of anarchism, where like we absolutely need the state to get out of the problems that we're in, and you're telling a set of stories about sort of how to think about the history of the state that might cause us to be hopeful. But the question is, like, what if you're wrong and say Charles Tilley is right, and then you go off and do your coding, and that like, do the data methods actually provide ways of alerting you to the fact that the theory that you're coding into the data mining might be wrong or missing something? And if not, I mean, you know, I can imagine like a happy ending to this that just says like, well, this is why like history departments need to be talking to data scientists, because we might need theory outside the data science. But the question is like, are there ways in which the methods themselves that you're advocating can solve the kind of classic coding problem of garbage in, garbage out? Or I'm not saying that we were doing, I'm just saying like in all coding, or in a lot of coding until this point, the conception of the object at the outset is going to frame what it can and can't do. So
Yes. So I answer, go ahead and answer. Yes, the answer to Aaron's question is very much the same as the answer to Debash's and maybe Frank's question as well. It's that the methods are agnostic about what you ask about. So you can go looking for sets of emotional experiences. You can go looking for the representation of gender. You can go looking for the activities of the state, the geographical activities of the state, the consequences for class of the state, the links to violence, and you can measure any of those things over time. You have to come in with hypotheses. So that's one of the reasons why I'm imagining a division of labor. So some of the indexing, and we just did this in the graduate student workshop. A year or two ago, Friedrich had given me a list of keywords for the Anthropocene, and we looked for them in Parliament over 200 years. The students and I sat down for an hour and read the word embeddings and talked about what they mean. So the outcome is determined by what the keywords are. And Aaron would give me a totally different set of keywords, and Debash would give me another set of keywords. And we would have different answers to look at in every case. In addition, and I make this point throughout the book, it's still an interpretive object. So there's no one single algorithm. I'm describing word embeddings, which are fairly open. There's so many, you could ask for the state, you can ask for the constitution, you can ask for so many near neighbor words, and the results they'll tilt in different directions. But we could also look at grammatical analysis, we could look at geospatial analysis, and we could use those to correct for each other. So the critical search method recommends trying at least 3 different algorithms. Reminds us that the output of any one algorithm has to be read. You have to go back to the original text, and the 12 readers will read the text 12 different ways. So none of it is determinative. The methods don't determine the questions you ask, they don't determine the theory that you come with. You come with the theory. Yes.
Thanks. So you kind of just want to create this like fantastically reproducible. That's going to cost enormous amounts of money and back at the university. But in a sense, I would say, supposing we do this, supposing it exists, to a large extent, it sounds like the sort of target for this system will be stuff that is actually going on within life. Given that, I want to ask about the possibility of recursive effects. What happens as the practice of audit that you mentioned halfway through is appreciated by the target institutions and societies that you're actually trying to audit? And they presumably adopt techniques of recording and investigating and so on and so forth. It's as it would game the system.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a good thing. So I think about this in Parliament because my lab created an interface called Democracy Lab. You can see the beta version already, the cleaner version is coming. You can navigate through the data-driven visualization of history. You can come with your questions about the state, Aaron can come with his, and you can type them in and get the data-driven visualization. And in the version that's coming this summer, you'll be able to click through to the text. So you can use this with Congress and Parliament. You can also upload your own data set. It was designed for classroom use by historians who don't know how to code, you just use the visual to navigate from overviews back to the text. So as we were working on it, we've been working on it for a long time. And as we were working on it, I've been trying to imagine what would happen with recursions. If you're in Congress, and suddenly Joe Gooley is tracking every time you say something nasty about an environmentalist, you're probably going to stop that, or you're going to mask it, or you're going to try to outgame the system. And I think about the Ryan Vieira's studies in the 19th century Parliament, where he shows that there was a similar kind of game in the 19th century after the second and third Reform Acts. As the working class can vote, the number of words spoken in Parliament, and I can see this in my data visualizations, it goes up and up and up and up. Vieira wasn't counting anything; he was just like going through answers, looking at reports, and his mechanism is that the reports are getting reprinted in the newspapers, the debates are getting reprinted in the newspapers, which means that if I'm representing the shoemakers of Manchester, they're going to come to my office unless I talk about concerns of the shoemakers of Manchester every week. So I've got to stay in every debate. I've got to make sure that even if it means staying till 2 in the morning to talk about the shoemakers of Manchester, I'm going to make sure that that's in the newspaper. So it has effects, it has consequences. The debates go on until we are hours in the morning. And I think some of those consequences would be hard to anticipate. Like, will there be a kind of hiding behind more words? Will there be acts of circumlocution? Will there be an unwillingness to say certain things on the record? I mean, the speeches are already broadcast on C-SPAN. They're being gamed in one way now with sound bites. They might be gamed in a different way for text. But as I say, the text learning methods are agnostic. So there's always a possibility of circumventing whatever gamification happens and tracking it in a new way.
I shudder to think of some Congress where they not think of that. Two of them was Rob and then Paul. Last 2 questions.
Yeah, so I took the method writing question briefly and then question.
So methodologically, I'm learning. So I'm very sympathetic to this. I mean, my background is in economic history, so I think it's very good. And my basic methodological question is, and sort of organizational, do you think there's any hope for the bringing back together of basically like economic history style, like data work, which is a different kind of data, that's some of the things like causal inference, which I think have many uses and can be very useful as a second stage processing of the results of data analysis, like this kind of text mining. Do you see any hope organizationally for that to go on? Because my sense of being here so far is but then sort of just a theoretical question, very differently, maybe sort of an unfairly broad question, but is, so I know that you started as more of a history of capitalism. And I'm wondering, what do you think is the role in this new disciplinary trajectory that you're proposing, which I'm very sympathetic to? What do you think is the role of like the early modern story of capitalism? Like that other kind of history used to do, how does it fit in to this new project, basically?
So is there any hope for economic history of the old style? I mean, it's still around in such places if you look, right? Social history in France is still economic history, looking at the receipts, tracking them over time. The CAMPOP, the Cambridge Population Group, it's done all of this amazing GIS work, tracking the effects of demographics for women marrying earlier, moving as the railway gets to different towns in Britain. It's still going strong. That's quantitative history. That Bookart is at Irvine. Minnesota is ground zero of all of this. And Stephen Ruggles, a MacArthur Prize winner, said in some of his recent populations, he's done surveys where he quantitatively estimates how much quantitative history there is in history journals. And he says there have been 3 waves of the 20th century, and we're in the middle of an upward wave. Right now, we just don't know it. So is it happening? Yes. Why is it so hard to see? Because they are run leading research universities don't have it hired for it because it's a different set of history journals, or it's people in economics departments and business schools publishing in history journals. Sometimes business historians are trained in our departments, but then go to work elsewhere. So there are multiple questions determining that. Is there any hope? You know, I think really interesting conversations are happening. Like the social historians don't want to have a conversation with Canada. But one of my colleagues, another digital historian, Kitty McDonough, a graduate of Stanford, social historian of roads, drank the Kool-Aid, became a social digital historian of roads, digitalized all these maps, learned how to code, learned how to scrape text from maps. And then she trained machine learning algorithms to recognize all the rail space. So she's asking a super social question, like how much of the city is dedicated to rail and what's that do to our spaces of interaction. She's answering it quantitatively with visual materials. There's a lot of social thinking involved. And her work is not quite CAMPOP because it's not just tables of numbers. She reads all of the social history. She has totally new sources, but it starts being right next to the CAMPOP data. Both they can map them on top of each other, like a question of how much space is rail space plus the birth rates in cities. So it may start to jostle, but this process is very new. I mean, 15 years ago, we didn't know what digital history was when Adrian hired me to teach it here. We really didn't. We kind of made it up. And then we had to get rigorous because there were historians asking hard questions. And the hard questions turned out to be incredibly juicy. So I think Katie's generation, the next generation, will start using these sources in new ways, and they will arouse strange conversations that go past the boundaries that we established for history in the year 2024. We say business history is over there. Take a left, please. They may find them in the same room, in the same conversation, within the same articles and books. And that would be very interesting. The second part of the question was about early modern landscape and how those questions are related to my questions about climate change. I think of them as totally continuous. 15 years ago, I was giving these lectures on 700 years of the landscape state, and the point wasn't that it's the same state. It's that, for me, it's the problem is that 17th to 18th century questions about improvement in the work of the state are very refined because we have battled over them for decades and centuries. And when I read work on the 20th century, it seems to me incredibly new. It seems to me that world system use models and Foucault are the only tools they have. And so because there isn't a robust engagement with Weber, there aren't questions about expert rule, its virtues and its vices. That those were refined in studies of 18th, 19th century efficacy of the state. And I got so interested in those problems that I wound up following the state all the way into the 20th century. So that's the work that I have been doing. I'm now writing a little about the 19th century, which is actually the research that I did first, which took a while to write about. I started using text mining methods thinking that they would be useful for making my way through larger and larger bureaucracies in the 20th century. I still write the digital research that I did to support those findings on 19th and 20th century state practices. So the work will keep coming. But it also steers us into these climate questions where I feel like, other people have better questions than I do. And maybe we need multiple people asking questions of the algorithms. We certainly need multiple people telling us which archives to go.
Like Frank announcing. But I wonder about this kind of the Keeling curve, and hearing you talk about the way that text mining can, discover kind of patterns, the way people speak in parliament, how it's, likening climate activists to terrorists, things like that. And you started to give an answer to the question I had, but I still remain a little skeptical, honestly. I mean, because it seems to me that, when people, particularly kind of demagogic politicians are found out, their kind of rhetorical patterns. I mean, I don't necessarily think that the reaction is, if Marjorie Taylor Greene needs humanities, digital humanities, but I'm not sure that the reaction is necessarily circumspection. I think, in a way, like the Keeling curve, it's sort of just to pollute the atmosphere even more to kind of accelerate that process. So I maybe
Yes. That's what I call the negative dialogue, right? So we can think that all of these beautiful maps of society are giving us some sort of an image that they're leading to the education of society about itself. But that still makes room for negative dialectics in which the information is put to other purposes and other narrations of society. That's right.
Someone don't need to end on that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joe. Clearly there's a reception. I don't see why you choose, but I'm sure. Oh, okay. So there is.
You should announce that.
Yes. All right. So there's apparently a reception in the tea room. Okay. I'll lead the way.